we've learned from Associated Press that there is no real defense for Ukrainians, and Ukrainian soldiers have nowhere to hide after moving away from the front line. How do you see the current situation of the conflict in Ukraine, and how did it work so far for NATO?
Well, the curious thing is that NATO and the US and all the other countries who have been involved have been in denial about Russian strength. Actually, they've impugned it. On January 4th, I'm sorry, July 4th last summer, the head of the CIA said Russia has suffered a strategic defeat. It's really embarrassing to them, and the unpreparedness of the Russian forces has been laid bare. Okay, his words. 6 days later, the president, listening to the CIA director, William Burns, says, I think was in Helsinki. He said, Putin has already lost this war in Ukraine. So the rub is that no journalist at any one of these briefings or speeches ever says to the president or anybody else, hey, what about that? I thought that Russia had already lost, and now you're telling me Ukraine's going to lose unless we give them $60 billion more dollars. How does that parse, Mr. President? Well, the answer is that it doesn't parse, and that this is not about Ukraine. It's about trying to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia, which is a fool's errand. And there was a study just publicized just this morning by a blogger named Simplicius. He's really quite good. And what he talks about is an article in the Royal United Services Institute in London, very prestigious, probably been around longer than all other such think tanks. Folks, lot on Russia, of course. And what that says is, look, you've been really deceived into thinking that maneuver warfare is the name of the game. It's attrition. Do you know there's something what attrition is? Attrition. Some of the words here are really quite interesting. If the West is serious about the possibility of a great power conflict, like the strange thought that Putin will go on after Ukraine to seize more territory, if the West is serious about a great power conflict, it needs to take a hard look at its capacity to wage a protracted war and to pursue a strategy focused on attrition rather than maneuver. Now, I know you have several guests who know a lot more about the military situation than I do, Scott Ritter being one, and the die is cast. Even Ukrainians, even our defense secretary says, things have turned. What did Secretary Secretary of Defense say?
Lloyd Austin.
Quote. Yeah, Lloyd Austin, right. Quote, situation has worsened significantly in recent days. It has shifted a bit. Well, actually, it shifted a bit. So we were winning. Well, of course, last July we had already won, according to President Biden. Now it's shifted a bit. And the commander-in-chief of Ukrainian forces, Syrskyi, is saying, it's worsened very significantly in recent days. So, Nima, where does that bring us? That brings us to a realization on the part of NATO, as embodied in this new study just released, that NATO and the United States have lost this war, that because of, and this is mentioned in this study, because of geographics, because of Russian power, because the Russians can build 155 millimeter or whatever millimeter they use for artillery shells, because there are more Russians, many times more Russians than there are Ukrainians, and not least because the Russians consider US and NATO involvement in Ukraine an existential threat. Russia has the upper hand. And this was clear. This was clear to Obama when Biden was vice president. It was clear to Blinken, and Blinken said so. Blinken said, anything we do in terms of aiding Ukraine will be matched and doubled and tripled and quadrupled by Russia. End quote. Whoa, he said that, right? When he was Deputy Secretary of State under Obama. So how did things change? Should they change the industrial capacity of Russia or change the geography between Ukraine and Russia? Man, hello. I don't know why Blinken changed his mind, but clearly Biden has this thing about Putin and has this thing about Ukraine. And he's pursuing a really dangerous policy now because he's upped the ante with this additional aid. Now he asked where it would be leading. Well, there's an interesting article. Actually, it's written by a fellow who knows the United States as well as Russia quite well. His name is Dmitry Trenin. He's now a big think tank person in Russia, has the ear of the Kremlin, as so many people like him do. And what he's advising here is that it's time to give the United States a nuclear reminder. Whoa, nuclear reminder. That doesn't sound like Dmitry Trenin. Dmitry Trenin was head of Carnegie, the Carnegie Institute's Russian post there in Moscow. He was very, very well respected. And when he saw that Putin was forced, in his words, was forced to invade Ukraine, then he decided, well, this is really, I need to show which side is doing the right thing here. And he switched, and of course he was fired immediately by Carnegie. Now, just as an aside, Carnegie used to be a really, really good institute. I guess after Jessica Tuchman, who is Barbara Tuchman's daughter, after she stopped being head of Carnegie 20 years ago or so, when they were right on Iraq, okay, one of the few places that was right, they filled it with little chinovniki, the Russians call bureaucrats, people, Democrats waiting to be appointed to the next administration and so forth. Anyhow, Carnegie has receded in stature, but Trenin was good up until the special military operation. What else does he say here? Yeah, he sort of repeats what Obama says, and he says, it's impossible for Ukraine to inflict a military defeat on Russia. There are too many Russians. There are too many shells that the Russia has. The Ukrainians don't have many men. The Ukrainians don't have many shells. Hello? What else does he say? Yeah, so what we need to do, this is Trenin, is move from a kind of a passive deterrent posture to an active one. Whoa, what does that mean? Well, we have to put, in Trenin's words, put fear back into the minds and hearts of the enemy's leaders. The enemy, people he used to work for, Carnegie Foundation, the U.S. It would be a beneficial kind of fear, says Trenin. And in the process, it could change the name of deterrence to something else. So what we're going to do here is doctrinal changes which change the circumstances under which we might consider nuclear war. Here, get this. Underwater and aerial patrols along the coasts of the likely enemy. Again, enemy used, not partner or adversary. And what else? To bring the enemy to halt and encourage it to engage in serious dialogue. Warnings of this kind of attacks on air bases, supply centers, strategic stability, all this business needs to be put into play to include, and this is key, no-fly zones in the Black Sea. Now, I don't have time to watch Russian TV, but friends of mine do. And they tell me that this topic of putting no-fly zones in the Black Sea is very, very much in evidence in Russian talk shows and Russian interviews of people who have the Kremlin's ear. What would that mean? Well, some of these long strikes that the Ukrainians have been able to do with advanced missiles like ATACMS from the United States, they can't be guided to their appropriate destination without some people flying over what would be a no-fly zone in the Black Sea. So this just as a symptom of the pressure that Putin himself is under from his own people, not to mention his military, to say, look, we've got it going here in Ukraine. Let's finish them off. Now, Putin's been under that kind of pressure for over 2 years. What's he going to do? All I can offer is my opinion, which comes of a half century of watching Soviet and then Russian leaders. Putin is unique in this respect. He's not going to do something irrational. He's not going to do something that doesn't parse, that could incite a nuclear war. Believe it or not, there are some people in the U.S. military, as well as in the neocon circles, that would just as soon use a little low-yield nuclear weapon just to show the Russians that we mean business, okay? So what's Putin going to do? Well, he's on the march in Ukraine. He's attriting in a much faster and effective way than we have seen heretofore. Over the last weeks, Russia has moved its troops beyond some of the lines there along that long line between Ukrainian and Russian forces. Could he go as far as the Dnieper River, which is sort of a natural divide between East and West Ukraine? Yes, he could. Will he? I don't think so. Look at the map. Sometimes it helps to look at the map. The territory existing between the Russian lines now and the Dnieper is considerable. It's several times the size of the territory that Russia has incorporated now into Russia proper. Does Putin want the kind of insurgency situation that the United States faced in Vietnam or in Afghanistan? No, Putin knows what kind of deal that is. So what I expect him to keep doing, attrition. And this is important, Nima, at the same time, in every speech saying, we're ready to talk. We're ready to talk, but we're not going to talk with that comedian who isn't funny. This guy that has this formula that we have to surrender before we talk. That's out of the cards. Now, what Putin has offered is, well, in a very tacit way, Kharkov, city in north, that part of Ukraine, and Odessa in the south. Now, Kharkov is several million people. Does he want to take over Kharkov, even though many of those people are pro-Russian? I don't think so. I think he'd prefer to do it otherwise. Does he want to take over Odessa? Well, yeah, I think he does. Odessa has been a Russian city from day one, from Catherine the Great at the time of the U.S. Revolution against Britain. Will he take over Odessa? Well, he has made an overture, I would say. When he was asked a question at one of these very long Q&As back in October of 22, someone said, I'm going to go visit Odessa. Should I apply for a Ukrainian or a Russian passport? Pretty clever. So Putin says, wow, Odessa, such a beautiful city. Beautiful city. Odessa could be what he called a Yabloko Razdora. Yabloko is apple, Razdor, conflict. So it could be, the Trojan War the apple of discord, or, says Putin, it could be a means of getting people together, look at their mutual objectives and aims, and working out something peacefully. Whoa! Now, did anybody tell Biden about that? I tried. Veteran intelligence professionals for sanity tried. I don't think got that through. Is that offer still stand? I don't know. But you ought to try. You ought to ask about it. Is that still on the table? Okay. Because again, Odessa is key. Without Odessa, Ukraine becomes a big farm for the rest of Europe. And I think that Putin, as long as he has this cordon sanitaire, a buffer zone between his forces and the forces of Ukraine, and that would be 200 miles now, okay, with the ATACMS. As long as he had that kind of buffer zone, I think he would be able to negotiate about Odessa, maybe turn it into an international city, just so the Ukrainians could have access to the Black Sea and not become just a farm. Okay, I think that Putin sees that in his interest, but he can't negotiate with himself. He's got to figure out some way to bring the United States into serious talks, and I think he probably will make it very clear that failing that, he's just going to keep going gradually toward the Dnieper River until such time as the U.S. realizes, oh, darn, he can take all of this part of Ukraine before the election. My God, before the election, what would that mean? We've discussed before. That would mean a clear loss, an obvious loss for the United States and NATO, clear win for the Russians, and a clear loss, I think, in the election for Biden, and could be a clear loss in their freedom, since if this guy comes back again as president, he's going to be very vindictive. And does he have the evidence of bribery and other things on not only Hunter Biden, but Daddy, and other illegal things on the part of Blinken and Sullivan? He sure as hell does. And that's coming out now. There's lots of material that show the tricks that they employed to try to get him to lose the election in 2016, and then to, what's the word, to emasculate him in terms of doing anything constructive vis-a-vis Russia.
Ray, we've seen that there is a video that shows Ukrainian army setting Donald Trump's picture on fire. And in your opinion, what was the reason behind this video? What was the message they wanted to send to Donald Trump or anybody out there? Because it doesn't make sense, Ukrainians getting involved in the US domestic policy. That would be a very consequential act on their part, and they don't benefit from this.
Well, Nima, you're being very reasonable, very logical, but Ukrainians are really very short on logic and long on extremism. The Ukrainians have interfered in our election. They interfered in the 2016 election. And that's one of the things that's coming out now in court documents and other testimony, that the Ukrainians were used by the Democrats to try to make sure Trump didn't win, and then to blacken him thereafter. So it's very, very complex, but the Ukrainians have been working hand in glove with the Democrats for a long time. And I can't explain why Trump's picture would be we set on fire. I know a lot of people in the United States like to do that, but millions and millions and millions of others want to put a votive candle underneath it. So how to explain this one incident? It's beyond me, other than to say that you can't always look for logic on the part of Ukrainians.
Ray, the other conflict in that region is this new, some sort of color revolution in Georgia. It seems that it's getting more serious and getting more dangerous when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine. That we've seen what has happened to Ukraine so far. And it seems that they're doing the same in Georgia. They're doing these type of movement in Georgia. How do you see the situation in Georgia right now?
It's very contentious, as you mentioned. There's a big movement to do the kinds of things he just mentioned, the color revolutions there. I don't know how it's going to come out, but it seems to me right now that the government does have the upper hand. And, whether this money spent by outside forces will have any dividends other than to increase governmental repression of all dissidents in Georgia. Whether that happens or not, I just can't say. But for those of your viewers who forget what happened in 2008, let me just say that when it became clear that Condoleezza Rice and Dick Cheney and George Bush were saying, look, not only Ukraine, but Georgia can be part of NATO, can be a member of NATO. Formal declaration, April 3rd, 2008, Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, quote, end quote. Well, Saakashvili, who was the head guy there in Georgia at the time, thought that was carte blanche for him to bloody the noses of Russians who had been peacekeepers in the northern part of this Ossetia, and they started shooting at them, artillery. And the Russians said, my God, these guys are out of their mind. They came through these tunnels under the mountains and obliterated the Georgians' force, went all the way to Tbilisi, the capital, and then stopped and said, look, we don't want Tbilisi, but don't do that anymore, okay? Don't do that anymore. That was 2008. Saakashvili ended up being an official in Ukraine later on. What goes around comes around. So these are the kind of corrupt officials that had been in power in Georgia. Whether there's still enough of them to cause this kind of trouble,